Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today with Astoria Bookshop for Bookstore Romance Day. I'm Christian. I'm one of the booksellers at the store, and I'm very excited to introduce our two authors here today for Bookstore Romance Day. Um, Today is a celebration of romance books and all kinds of romance across the board, and so we have two authors here today for to celebrate that. So I'm just going to go right into it to introduce our two authors who I'm very excited to introduce. So Adriana Herrera was born and raised in the Caribbean, but for the last 15 years has let her job and her spouse take her all over the world. She loves writing stories about people who look and sound like her people, getting unapologetic happy endings. When she's not dreaming up love stories, planning logistically complex vacations with her family, or hunting discount Broadway tickets, she's a trauma therapist in New York City, working with survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And then Olivia Dade grew up an undeniable nerd, prone to ignoring the world around her. She read any book she could find. Her favorites, though, were always romances. As an adult, she earned her MA in American history and worked in a variety of jobs that required the donning of actual pants, such as Colonial Williamsburg interpreter, high school teacher, academic tutor, and, of course, librarian. Now, however, she has finally achieved her lifelong goal of wearing pajamas all day as a hermit-like writer and enthusiastic hag. She currently lives outside Stockholm with her patient Swedish husband, their whip-smart daughter, and the family's ever-burgeoning collection of books. And now, we begin our very wonderful and exciting conversation.
So Adriana and I chatted a little bit yesterday, and we came up with some questions that we thought would work and that we're good friends as well as fellow authors. So we figured we'd try to keep things generally light, but cover some things that I think will be interesting to people. So did you want to start out talking a little bit about our favorite romance tropes?
Yes, that's always a good one to start with.
I want to hear about yours. I have mine ready. Tell me about yours.
I've been thinking a lot about this because I've been having a lot of conversations about fan fiction and fandoms, which we'll talk about a little later. And I was having a conversation distinguishing between archetypes, like different types of like characters, like you have your Kylo Rens, and then you have the tropes, or like, you have your Draco Malfoys or your Harry Potters, and then you have the tropes that fit those characters or the different ships.
Mm-hmm.
I think I really love rivals to lovers. I don't necessarily love an enemies to lovers, because I do if it's well done, but that trope specifically has like a lot of potential to become problematic. But rivals to lovers I like a lot, especially because we write I write contemporary, or have written contemporary so far, and there's a lot of workplace romances that like the rivals to lovers really kind of like lends itself for like really fun banter and like competition and things like that. Like I think about like the Hating Game or something like that, where like the banter and like the back and forth is amazing. And then I think another one is like unrequited love, like friends to lovers. Like people have been like friends for their entire lives, and there's one person that's like just pining for the other is a good one. I think those probably like would be my favorite. Like I'll try anything that's well done, but I think those two, like friends to lovers, rivals to lovers. How about you?
I was chatting about this the other night with Milwaukee Library. We were talking about, for me, how enemies to lovers can go very wrong, because if they do something at the beginning when they're enemies, if they say or do something that I find personally unforgivable, there's no going back. If someone said that to me or did that to me, I would never forgive them. Then it's done. It can be done and done very, very well, but for me, it's much more potentially problematic than rivals to lovers, or in my case, I really do love friends to lovers, especially if they've both been pining. but like, so I think on AO3, on Archive of Our Own, it's often the tag Forest of Pines.
Yeah.
Like, or Two Dummies in
So
Love.
Dummies in Love. Oh, that's one of my favorite tags.
Exactly. So, I mean, I love that, although generally because I just am not good with angst these days or anything that makes me too stressed. So, and I find that those stories are often quite sweet. They can have, other graphic elements or sex, but they're often quite sweet. I love forced proximity. I mean, that's the lifeblood of romance novels a lot of the time is, give them a reason where they can't get away from each other.
Only one bed.
Only one bed, the genre.
Exactly. I think I literally have like just used that to promote a book. Literally, like there's a grumpy one, there's a sunshine one, and there's only one bed. Like that's the promotion.
Yeah, I mean, I found myself I've gotten more and more into fan fiction. I found myself thinking about my stories in terms of tags as much as trope, like hurt, comfort. Well, of course, this is a classic romance. I mean, this is a very specific trope, but I still love the kissing for science.
Yeah.
Where like there's some sort of experiment or scientific discovery involved, and then so like I have to know what it's like scientifically to kiss as the experience. As an objective observer, I would like to see what this feels like. So
yeah, that's a good one. I mean, fake relationship is a really good trope, and I think it's like a tried and true trope for like romance, where like let's pretend we're dating, let's pretend we're engaged, and we're not gonna have feelings at all for each other after these like 5 weeks of being together all the time and acting like we're in love.
Totally platonic, unless
there's only one bed.
Oh no! Oh no!
Oh no! Who could have expected for the only one bed? And that's the thing about, I think, people underestimate, right? Like the level of thinking or planning or fine tuning that you have to do to keep these tropes that are done again and again and again fresh and different, and having like elements that like feel new to the reader but also familiar, like they kind of know what the dynamic is that's going to happen, but then you can still surprise them. And like that to me is truly like where genre authors, like genre fiction in general, authors do that is, I think, like where we really like have like craft down, because we have to we have to continue to write within the conventions of the genre and the rules of the game, and still provide stories that are fresh, that feel different, that can give the reader something that they've never experienced before. And yet we are very much confined to these specific types of storylines, because it's the same thing like with mysteries. Like somebody's got to be die, and then you've got to find out who did it by the end, and it's got to be a surprise. So but yet mystery writers continue to do that. So I think like that's the sort of stuff like I always love to talk about, like just craft and romance, because there is so much to it.
And another conversation that that I really appreciate when talking about romance as a craft, and what makes it specifically takes a lot of skill, is that you have assuming that you have two main characters, but there can be more, obviously, but you have to trace both of their character arcs. Like all the main characters have to have an individual character arc, something in them that needs to change over the course of the book that has to be traced. So you have, in my cases, I usually write MF. So you would have the hero's character arc, you would have the heroine's character arc, and then you also have the actual relationships arc.
Yep.
And then you're supposed to bring all of those all to a satisfying conclusion in ways that feel earned, in ways that you have sort of teased out over the course of the entire book, so that it feels like a natural, satisfying progression to the end. So even apart from, you know, obviously we work on craft as far as writing on the sentence level too, and pacing and all those other things. But there's a lot of challenges involved in making sure that the ending is satisfying on a variety of levels.
Yeah. And I think, like, honestly, and maybe that could like segue us into like fanfic, because this is something that I've been, and I mean, like, if you follow me on Twitter, you know, like, I talk about fandoms a lot and like talk about my love for fanfic a lot. But one of the things that I do believe like makes a difference with someone that is a fanfic reader or is a fanfic author and then like kind of goes into romance as a writer is that you really do learn how to like really polish, refine, hone a specific archetype, dynamic, a specific character arc. Like if your thing is writing like Stucky fanfic, like you're writing Steve and Bucky and you're going back again and again to that hurt comfort, to that like you're my person over like literally decades, like I've been pining for you while they like brainwashed me for like 50 years and I still could only remember you, like that level of like soulmate type love. If you go again and again and again to that specific dynamic, you can write hurt and comfort like nobody else can write hurt and comfort, because you've like really explored all the layers and all the ways like those two specific characters can develop. And it really is like, and still kind of like still deliver that same like happy ending, but really like letting like those dynamics and those character arcs unfurl like to a very layered degree.
Right. So are Stucky and Raylo your main fandoms, or do you have other ones?
Those are the ones that I keep going to more now. Like I started like with like Buffy. Like that was like my deep dive into fandom. I think probably was Buffy. But I've like, you know, Harry Potter was like a bit like one that I read a lot of. Sherlock for a while. Merlin for a bit. So I've had different fandoms that I like go in and out of, but the MCU has been one that I've been like really into in the last few years, specifically Stucky I really like, or I'm obsessed with it, a lot of it. And then like Raylo too. I think like I feel like that last movie really like I really needed to feel like someone to repair some of my issues with how that movie ended, and fanfic has really helped with that. So yeah, those are the two that I've been going mostly to. I've read a lot of Mandalorian fanfic in the quarantine, so what have you been reading? Tell me about your fanfic.
Mine, by far, I've explored other fandoms. Like I did some with, they're often that have limited, sort of a more limited audience with some very good writers. But Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries, and you know, there's a little bit with the Jane Austen. And I would like to I need to rewatch Pitch so I can get more into the fandom for Pitch, because I know that there's a lot of people who wanted more, and it sounds amazing. But my main fandom, and speaking of unsatisfying endings, is within Game of Thrones. Of course. Is the Jaime Lannister Brienne of Tarth relationship. And it's really a fandom that is gifted with just some amazing writers. I did not realize going in. Like for some reason, despite the fact that I have been a lifelong shipper, to the point where when I was in middle school, and this dates me and I don't care, I'm 43, right? So we had two VCRs, and I set up the VCRs next to each other so that I could take videotapes from Days of Our Lives. There was a relationship that I liked on Days of Our Lives, right? And all the scenes of them together, I took from my videotapes episodes, and then basically did my own fan supercut of this relationship, Jack and Jennifer, which later I realized apparently started out like really heinously, but I didn't know. I was just a shipper. So like before YouTube, I was there making on 2 VCRs my own fan supercut. So like I am a lifelong shipper, but I did not discover fan fiction till the last couple of years.
Mm.
But once I did, it was like, you know, I just loved it. And some of the, compared to published work, you know, obviously there are differences depending on, you know, there's a whole range of authors, just as there are in published works too. But some of these, the creativity, because they're not within the bounds of sort of the publishing industry, there's no one saying, well, that's not a marketable idea. And so they have just boundlessly creative ideas and are completely unafraid of taking the same, as you said, a central dynamic, a central relationship, and spinning it out in the past, in the present, in the future.
News,
paranormal, and, you know, soul marks. You know, I was reading, you know, there's time loops. I was reading a really interesting one with a time loop the other day. The one I'm reading actually am reading right now, not obviously right this second, that would be rude, but before I started this, is set in a mathematics graduate program, and the sub-theme basically is about sexism in STEM. I mean, so it's beautifully written. So like you can take that central dynamic and put it into all sorts of different situations and subject areas, and it's amazing. I think fan fiction is incredible.
It is, and I think, and I've talked about this some or a lot, and it's like specifically I think for marginalized people, like for queer people or for people of color who really haven't had the opportunity to see themselves as the center of the stories in fiction, in media. Fan fiction repairs a lot of that. Like, it's like what I was saying, like Stucky, like, if you've watched The Avengers, you know that Peggy was not Steve's one true love. It was Stucky. It was Bucky. Like, that relationship is the one that, like, he came back from again and again. But because cis heteronormative life and world, you, like, could they make, you know, the main couple of the Avengers universe two men?
Right.
They could have, they didn't. So then you go to fanfic, and for those of us who feel strongly about like that pairing, you could have that love like explored in like a million different ways. And it's the same with a lot of like side characters. Like a lot of the side characters in a lot of these universes are people of color or queer people, but we never get to be the center.
Right.
And in fanfic, that is repaired. Like we kind of like can be shifted into the center, and we can center ourselves. We can literally embody these characters that never get to look like us. So it's, I mean, I could literally, like, this hour could be about my love for fan fiction, but we did say it was just going to be a little bit. But
I made no promises.
It's romance, right? So it's really about relationships, and I think that like that's the piece to me. Like, in people who read fiction but really don't read romance and have this thing to have a reservation because they don't think it's, I don't know, smart enough or whatever, is thinking about the amount of thinking that goes into making, for example, like the stories we write, right? You write about fat women living their best lives and finding love. I write about queer people. I write about queer Black people, queer Afro-Latinx people, and thinking about what we have to do, A, to create space for those stories, and B, to create thoughtful stories where you have a viable, believable, hopeful, happy ending for our characters that don't rely on breaking them or trauma porn or putting them through the ringer, as has been like the narrative of how people who are on the margins can find love.
I mean, to backtrack and then sort of add to what you're saying, I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that the fandom that really drew me in is the Jamie Brienne fandom, because while she's not fat, in canon, she is supposed to be not just not pretty, but openly ugly.
Right.
Like, she is not meant to be traditionally attractive in any way. And in some ways, I am certain that's part of what drew me to her, even though I do a lot of fat rep, like older women fat rep. But the fact that she is not traditionally attractive, and then, you know, the love in the series and in the fan fiction is based on sort of character, and, you know, the attraction comes, but it's based on sort of finding out who she is as a person and loving that person, and then loving her in her totality, including her face and her body. I mean, Gwendolyn Christie is beautiful. So, I mean, that wasn't quite the same in the show, although, you know, they tried to make her look bad, but there's really only so much she can do, really. She's Gwendolyn Christie. She's insanely gorgeous. But, and then I think sometimes sort of, this is something I talked about in Spoiler Alert. And Spoiler Alert, and my series through Avon, is based on my love of fan fiction. I mean, the entire premise of this is that you have an actor who is basically an actor in a show like Game of Thrones, who hates the way the show is ending, how it is ended, and just is very devastated by what's happened to his character. So he's writing fix-it fan fiction.
You should show the cover. Show the cover.
Okay, yes, thank you. I always forget.
Beautiful.
It is beautiful. And then he has a best friend in the fandom. It turns out he meets her in person, but he can't really tell her because he's been criticizing the show pretty openly. And it can't be found out that he's actually an actor on the show. So, but one of the big points that I make in the book is that I think sometimes with Game of Thrones, but also sometimes other genres, and sometimes people in media as a general idea, there's some sort of idea that happy endings and love are somehow less realistic than misery.
Right.
And I would say that, yes, lives often contain misery, but I also think it's unrealistic to say that lives only contain misery,
Right.
that there is no point, that there are no happy relationships out there. There are no relationships that if you stopped at a certain point, you would say these people are really happy together. And I think there's often a sort of intellectual cachet given to, as you call, sort of misery porn, for lack of a better word, that somehow it is grittier and more realistic for everyone to die and for everything to end badly than to have a more nuanced view. It doesn't mean everything's going to be great. And I think that's pretty clear in Spoiler Alert, that there's some relationships that can't be fixed, and you have to draw boundaries, but that doesn't mean that somehow it's a more realistic view of humanity, that everyone is going to suffer for the foreseeable future. I don't buy it.
No, and I go back to, I mean, just to piggyback onto that, and just kind of talk about also like how people of color are rendered in fiction, literary fiction, or even like when you think about a movie like 12 Years a Slave, right? Where the black body is broken again and again and again and again and again. And that is what, you know, is art, right? That's what is adjacent to something that is considered highbrow or something intellectual. But then where is the joy? Like where do we get to exist in joy? What are the stories where we get to be people who strive for our dreams and also get to be whole people? And I mean, I think, like, I mean, I write a lot about these things, but that's something that I wanted to explore in American Love Story, because here's the cover. Yay. American Love Story is a Black Lives Matter romance. So it's a Haitian man. It's a queer romance. So it's two gay men, and Patrice is a Haitian man who came to the U.S. as a child. He came as a refugee and is now a professor in the Ivy League. And he falls for a white prosecutor, a DA, and this assistant district attorney in their town. And their police stops start to happen that are racially motivated. Mm-hmm. And so Patrice is a Black Lives Matter activist. Easton is a white prosecutor who's also from a wealthy family. And the book is about, the conflict in the book is them finding ways to be together when like systemic racism puts them at odds, and really exploring like what allyship is, that it's not enough to know that racism is wrong, but that you have to have skin in the game. And so to me, and there's a happy ending, like they fall in love. They don't fix racism because I can't fix racism in an 80,000 word book, but they have the conversation and exploring like the burnout of activism for Patrice, the burden of being the person that represents your entire identity, race all the time, microaggressions and all these things. And yet throughout they're falling in love, right? Like they're falling in love through the book. So there's romance, there's sex, there's chemistry, there's a future. And I think to me, that to me is more of the type of book that I feel like in this time, like not just this time always, but it's always been like, I think a better way to propose to readers that people in the margins deserve the same things that everyone else gets, as opposed to showing our pain in graphic detail and then saying, then you get, I guess you get to have what we all have.
Right. Right.
And romance does that, like, all the time. There's a ton of own voices authors writing romance about all kinds of people on the margins, like living their best lives or living through their struggle and still getting to have joy and getting their happy ending.
Right. Right.
So shall we move on to the next thing we had? We had pets in our books. That's the thing I wanted to talk about, the cat and in Here to Stay. But I've been thinking a lot about pets in books in general, just because again, I think it's one of those ways that people can like give someone like, or a character like a way to develop like an emotional arc that's not always just like relying on the relationship with the other protagonist. So I've been thinking a lot about it because it's like a little like device that you can use to kind of like show this other side of the person. That's just not what they have with the protagonist. But I'd rather talk about covers. What do you think?
Sure. I just wanted to share my one book that has pets, which is my tiny house book.
Tiny house book, that's right.
The female main character is a bit of a latter-day hippie, and she's longtime best friends with the male main character. So he was foolish enough to let her name his cat. So she named his cat Kitty Hendricks, and her dog is Harry Garcia. And I just,
that's so cute.
I was entirely too pleased with myself for coming up with this. Oh, and the cat is a total jerk. Like, the dog is sweet and dumb, and the cat is a total jerk. And at the end, though, they too have learned to adore one another. And
yes, that's a really cute novella. I think it's a good kind of like way of showing other sides to people, and it's because like in this book and Here to Stay, which is my book that's coming out in like a week and a half, the hero Rocco finds this little cat under his car, like when he comes out of the gym, and he basically like rescues it, and it's like freaked out when he finds it because he thinks it's gonna die. So it's like a good moment of him being like in an emergency that's not really an emergency, and the heroine like not being interested in this cat. She hates cats, and she's like, please get this like flea-ridden animal out of my house. So like it was a fun thing to write. But you and I have talked about covers before.
We have.
And we've talked about specifically covers for our self-published work. Both Olivia and I are hybrid authors, so we're traditionally published, but we also do stuff on our own and do like indie projects that we put out ourselves. And we actually both use the same cover artist for books that we put out this summer. And we both wanted mine was a queer romance set in Ethiopia. So it was a Dominican American protagonist and an Ethiopian protagonist. And Olivia had her heroine, who is a fat heroine who was on vacation.
And is 40, which is usually publishing, yes. This traditional publishing, that is, once you reach the late 30s and 40, it's hard.
It's very hard. And to
hard to get them to buy that.
Yeah, and it's very hard to find, like, let's say, for example, it's impossible to find stock photo with, like, you know, a gorgeous fat woman with, like, a cover model dude looking amazing and super happy. And it's the same, like, try to find two gorgeous, like, Black men embracing happily in stock photo.
Good luck.
Exactly. You can't. So we both use an illustrator to do our covers.
Her name is Lenny Kaufman, and she is amazing.
Amazing. I don't know if I can. This is my cover. Right. Here we go. Here we go.
On my face. And here is my cover.
Yeah. She's amazing.
She's amazing.
So
she's the same one who did Spoiler Alert.
That's right. And she did Citizen the Gale for you too, which is also beautiful. There it is, God. I love that cover so much. And she's done a few others. Like, I think we both discovered her because she did covers for another author who was a Black romance author, Mimi Grace, and she did this beautiful cover. And the thing about it is, for us, it's like, if we don't want to have a cover which is basically like a torso, half of someone's, like a random half of a face, like if we want to have like a person embracing or looking happy, like the title of my book is literally Finding Joy. So I wanted to have two men embracing, looking happy. And I just, for what I could pay for, like if I could have done a custom cover with like a photo shoot, which is a few $1,000s, then I would have maybe done that option. But I like what I can afford, and also a book that traditional publishing wouldn't buy. They would not acquire a book about two gay men set in Ethiopia. So I had to put that out myself. And so those are the options that I have. And the option that I had that could give me the exact cover that I wanted was an illustrated cover. Right.
I mean, if you look through, as you said, stock photos of, I mean, just looking for fat women, not even with anyone else. There are vanishingly few where those women are well lit and are clearly meant to be attractive. I mean, for by far the most of them are saying incredibly, they're on a scale. They're either eating an entire pizza by themselves or they have a bowl of fruit. Like it is very much about dieting and weight loss and before and after fatness. It's upsetting and it's harmful. I mean, I'm a survivor of disordered eating. Like was harmful for me to look at those stock photos. And that's even beyond looking at the issue of that, like, yeah, my heroine's 40. Like, try to find a hot 40-year-old who's fat, who's well lit, and like who looks anything like your character, And it would be even harder if it were. I mean, this is cishet white people. Yeah. So I mean, any marginalization. If I were looking for a disabled character or, anyone who, then it's hard to find stock photos. So, I mean, illustrated cover is essentially the equivalent of a custom photo shoot. And, in my case, it's said the hero is a former tennis pro, and so it's set on a tennis court, and, it looks exactly, she has silver streaks in her hair, and it's gorgeous. And she looks exactly like I wanted her to look, to the point where, like, the first version of the cover, which was also beautiful, I told him, like, make her waist bigger. Because often with fat people on the covers, fat women on the covers, they always make their waist tiny.
Right, like hourglass, still an hourglass figure, just like a slightly like more curvy.
Because for whatever reason, even in most romances with fat rep, you're allowed to have big breasts, big hips, big butt, not big anything else. And so my goal is, even within my covers, to have different body types within fatness, because not all fat people have the same body type. So, like, for Sweetest and a Gale, like, she doesn't really have particularly large boobs. She's just more like a rectangle. And Courtney Love, she has big breasts, because that's part of who she is in there. And spoiler alert, she is a little bit more of an hourglass. But again, that was another cover where I'm like, make the waist larger.
Yeah.
Because some fat women do have small waists, but I would say most don't have like super small waists.
Right.
So, I mean, that was really important to me, that even, obviously the rep is important to me in general, but that even just being fat was not entirely enough for me. I also wanted to make sure that there was representation of different types of fat bodies, and that they were all beautiful. And Lenny is so good at rendering different bodies and different types of people, a wide variety of people, as gorgeous and joyful. And it's art, and it's your cover, the lighting on your cover for Finding Joy. It's just, it fits the book, and it fits the title, and it's just beautiful.
Yep, she does a really beautiful job. Hey, she's like one of those people you just let her know one time what you need, and she gets it exactly right. And I think, and I mean, I think like the reality is that we deserve to have covers and like images and like presenting our books to the world that reflect what we're trying to put out there. Is like the people we write deserve like luscious, beautiful, like backgrounds and beautiful images reflecting like what they found with each other. And I think that to me is where being able to like have an illustrated cover really comes in handy for people writing own voices in general, because it really can allow us to like not have to rely on like a random object. Like it works for some people, like you can have like a stem of a flower or something, but I personally prefer covers that look like a romance cover. I know we're moving a little bit away from like that traditional like clinch, which is the embrace, but that I love to see two people like gazing at each other like you're the perfect person for me. That's like, because that's what our books do, right? Like that's what we bring to the world, like that hope, that love. So I am grateful that we can have illustrated covers that are a little bit more detailed, and that look like almost like paintings. Like they're so well done and so detailed.
And I'm sure reader response to the covers and to your rep in general, I'm sure there are a lot of people who are very happy to see themselves on your covers and on your pages in a way that they often do not.
Well, that's our next question for each other, and it's
I know, that was my segue.
That was a perfect segue. What responses, like what reader response have we received to our books, and what have been especially like poignant things that we've gotten from our readers? What have you gotten?
I would say that, since I started self-publishing, because, there was a book I read about 3 or so years ago that infuriated me to the point where I said that the fat rep was so damaging that I said from here on out, like, just assume all of my female main characters are fat. Like, I will make that clear on the page, but I'm like, you know, screw it. Like, if this is what's showing up as fat rep, then I'm doing this. I already did it some of the time, but now it's like, forget it. Like, I don't need to write skinny women. There are plenty of people writing skinny women out there. I'll write fat rep. And so I started doing that, and then self-publishing last year, I had a book set on a beach called Desire in the Deep Blue Sea. And on the front, it's an illustrated cover. It has a, you know, a woman in a swimsuit. And she's, I deliberately made her so that she was smaller on top and had a bigger butt and hips and thighs. So she was, you know, that was her body shape. And after publishing that, I had a couple people DM me, a couple of women DM me to say that in the books, my male main characters love the bodies of the female main characters. Like they just, not because they're fat, not despite their fatness, just because they think that they're incredibly sexy, right? And I try to make sure that they describe it so it's clear in the descriptions that the women are fat, but that's not a negative. That's not a pejorative. It's just a descriptor, right? And so a couple of people wrote me to say that they reread the sections where the hero's describing the heroine's body in a very, you know, admiring, loving way. And they reread that before they made themselves put on a swimsuit and go to the community pool, which they had not done for a long time. And I'm tearing up saying this, but that a couple of women wrote me to say that they put on swimsuits and went out in public for the first time in a while, that it helped them to have read that. And that, like, obviously I'm tearing up now. It meant the world to me. And, you know, this year I had Emily Hemingway, who is a reader and a Twitter friend, who cosplayed Tess and looked gorgeous.
That really was amazing.
It's incredible. I retweeted on my Twitter recently because somebody mentioned it, and she just looked gorgeous, and she looked exactly like Tess, and it was just the first time someone had ever cosplayed any of my characters, and it just meant the absolute world to me.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and again, I mean, for me, like that's who we're writing for. Like, again, it's what you said in the beginning. I write Black and brown worlds, and I write those worlds from my gaze, and it's, you know, whoever can read my stories and feel a sense of connection or feel seen, that's wonderful. But I am writing for people who have been reading romance their entire lives and never saw their particular selves in the book. Like a Dominican woman who is trying to run a nonprofit program, or, you know, a Dominican food truck owner who's trying to like hustle and get his business going, or like my heroine, Priscilla from American Sweethearts, was a police officer, but that's not her passion. Her passion is being like a sex educator for people of color, for marginalized people, for disabled people, non-binary people. And the conflict that she has, and I think that's the book probably I've gotten the most mail for, it's Priscilla's story, because she is a first generation Dominican American. Her parents came from the Dominican Republic, and she wants to make her parents proud. And, you know, there's a lot of stigma around jobs that are like, you know, she's like, how am I going to tell my mom that I'm like going to sell dildos now? Which is not her job, but like, that's like how she feels. She doesn't want to shame them. And also, but the job is killing her. Like, she's not happy in it anymore. And so like that conflict of wanting to stand on your own, and then knowing what your parents sacrificed so that you could have the ability to make those choices as a child of immigrants, is something that, like, you know, is a real thing. Like, it's a real world thing. And so I've had a few, not just Dominican, but I've had like a couple of like just other first generation immigrants who have read it told me like that particular conflict that Priscilla had really resonated and they felt really seen because they've had that because like it's a true thing. Like you come as an immigrant, you want to have a job that has security. You don't want to have a job that you can't count on, something that it's not like benefits or you have a pension or you get union benefits or whatever. It's so important for us as immigrants to have that security. And so that's something that has really resonated with so many people. And I've had quite a few for my queer romances. I've had quite a few, especially Finding Joy. Like I've had a couple of Ethiopian readers who have never read about Ethiopian people, like just like being in a book falling in love and not about like some of like the more difficult parts of Ethiopian history, which is basically just the getting to be in a romance. Was really nice. A couple like really kind of made me cry, but those are like, and I mean, to me, it's like that's what's worth kind of like having to go and do these self-published stories, because even though we know traditional publishing may not be ready for these stories, there are readers out there hungry for them, that need them, that literally need to read, like what you said, like about 40 Love, like women reading about Tess, like living her best, like bare boob life, and like, feeling gorgeous and amazing, and this like gorgeous man being like so into her, like, God, like we really need to read that. We really need to have books that like just reflect our lives back to us in ways that like make us feel beautiful and like we're deserving of that, because the world in general just doesn't ever do that.
Yeah.
Now I'm gonna cry. Okay.
You deserve to be desired, you deserve to be loved, and you deserve to have a happy ending.
Absolutely. But without caveats, without having to be like broken into 20 pieces in the book, or having someone do something horrible to you and like tear you apart or make you feel small. Like just throughout the whole book, just have someone like want to be with you.
And you can have conflicts, like real conflicts within a book, without it having to be the conflict to be that either that person is being ugly to you or that the world is being ugly to you.
Right.
While still talking about real world stuff. I mean, you talked about some of the, the Black Lives Matter sort of focus on, like, there is a certain amount of, I have some discussion of, fat shaming and fat phobia in a few of my books, especially in spoiler alert. But yeah, you don't have to tear them down to give them a happy ending.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's you can do a lot with like, sure, like you can have someone who's like not 100% trusting, someone who's like reluctant to fall in love again, someone that is weary of having their heart broken, someone that's in like with your hero in 40 Love, like a person who's in like a existential crisis because the life that he had is now lost to him, and he's trying to figure out who he's going to be, and he's angry about it but it's not, like, that's real stuff like that. And it doesn't have to be about him being terrible because something terrible happened to him.
Right.
And that's where like craft comes in, and I think Own Voices romances really do so much when it comes to nuance, because I think we just have a really deep understanding of how harmful like being simplistic about very complex things can be, and like going for reductive narrative can be so harmful, because we have been harmed by reading things that have a reductive, simplistic approach or angle for things that in reality are very complex and need to be like tended to in a different way. Let's see, we have about 10 minutes.
I mean, the three things that I had left is potentially, you can decide what you want to do, is we have the favorite lines in romances, others, and our own. We could talk a little bit about how and why you're doing beginning to delve into historical romance, or we could talk about, let's save the 2 romances to recommend for the very end.
Okay.
All right.
I forgot to get my favorite line.
You want to share mine? Go ahead.
I forgot to get my favorite line, but I can talk about one of the authors who has some of the most highlighted stories that I've read, like who I highlight the most. It's probably Kennedy Ryan.
Mm-hmm.
Her books, Queen Move, I think I highlighted like half of that book. She just has a turn of phrase. She can do something with a sentence that I truly like. It's remarkable the way she can write a story. And like her prose is like, I don't even know how to describe it. It's just so beautiful and so perfectly executed.
Mm-hmm.
She can just do feelings in a way that not a lot of people can do. So I would say she's probably has the most lines that I have highlighted for an author.
I picked 2 because I cheated.
Go ahead, because I picked none.
Okay, so first one is I wanted to sort of show the different types of lines that I sort of was talking about. One of them is one that made me laugh, and because her humor is it's Ruby Lane, and it was from House Rules, and which is a wonderful book. It's a long divorced couple lives in New York City, and they eventually end up moving in together because they need to save money on housing. So and they fall in love again and sort of try to reconcile the things that drew them apart the first time. And she has such wry, wonderful humor amidst all the really thoughtfulness and emotion in her books. In this line, I just laughed and laughed. I think they're talking about possibly moving in together. And she says, "You know why this is a bad idea? No, it's not just one bad idea. It's several bad ideas rolled into one large column of highly suspect ideas supporting a sign that reads bad idea." That was hilarious. And the other line that occurs to me sometimes, Joanna Bourne is one of the few authors who she writes these lines to seem like they would be aphorisms, like something that someone, that someone had written before. They're just so clever. Like one of the lines at the beginning of one of the chapters in Rogue Spy, she wrote, "No man, as John Donne points out, is an island, but some of them are very slender peninsulas." I just laughed at that, and I thought it was just very, very clever. So, and then the one I did pick a quick one of my own. It's from my second book I ever published, my Reckless Valentine. Yeah. And the hero, his family, as a joke, got him a ton of condoms for Christmas.
Yeah.
And then the heroine sees his stash and asks him why he has so many condoms, and then asks him if he triple wraps himself for freshness. To this day, is one of my favorite lines I've ever written. Anyway.
I think of my books that I think has the most banter, that as I was reading it for pull quotes, I was laughing out loud. What is Here to Stay, the book that's coming out next week. I actually think it's the funniest book I have written, and it has some lines. I was like, this is not bad. This is funny. When you like by the end of the revision process, you like hate every word of the manuscript. But I managed to laugh at a couple of things I wrote.
Yep. Do you want to talk a little bit about historical romance?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm in an anthology with a few author friends, and it's a historical anthology, which is new to me. I've only written contemporary so far. But what I read the most that's not romance is nonfiction, and I rarely read literary fiction anymore because, again, of the misery. Like I'm not in a place in my life where I can tolerate misery. My day job is pretty stressful, so I just don't do that to myself a lot anymore, unless it's vetted and it's like someone that's like, no, this is really good. So I read a lot of nonfiction. I read a lot of history books. So I've always been really interested in like thinking about writing historical. So I thought this was a good opportunity. And one thing that I would love to see more is Afro-Latinx people in historical romance.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, like for like the colonies, like like Dominican Republic is in the island of Hispaniola. Santo Domingo was the first city of the Americas. You know, like we were literally the first city of the America. It was where like the African slave trade began.
Mm-hmm.
And it was where like, you know, the ravaging of the Americas began, but also like where the wealth of the Western world, a lot of the wealth of the Western world came from. And so the idea, to me, it's like really interesting that we like, we don't fit into the historical romance space somehow, even though we were literally like bringing like from the islands was where like the beginning of like the wealth of so many of these like civilizations.
You're unspoken and unacknowledged all around the borders of all these historical romances with all these, for so many decades, all these heroes who made their fortunes.
Right.
And some of them made them in India, which is another obviously deeply problematic, and some of them had plantations.
And talk about the colonies. And when I read colonies in a historical romance, like I literally feel like ants under my skin. Because that's my ancestors. That's like the people that where I come from. And so how can we not be in it, right? And so I thought this is a good opportunity. So it's set in 1879, and it's a heroine who is from Santo Domingo. She's Dominican and British. So her dad was a exterior office person. Like he was like an officer of the exterior office. So basically, it was kind of like he was like a civil servant in the like diplomacy circles. He wasn't like a diplomat. And so I was reading a book about Haiti, and it's called Silencing the Past, and it's exactly about like the erasure of Black people from history. So in this book specifically, it's about the erasure of the Haitian Revolution and all this, but he was talking about a diplomat who was in the Afro-Caribbean islands for about 20 years. He was a British officer who kind of like came for a few years and kind of just stayed, and then became very involved in like political life in the island. And so, and then moved back to Britain and had brought his family. He got married to a Afro-Caribbean woman. I think she was actually Cuban, but then I got the idea like that could be interesting to have, because there it is. Like he could have had children, and those children would have then like been adults in London in the late 1870s.
Right.
So I thought that would be kind of like, at least it was kind of like my segue into like having like a real person in history that could have had potentially a child that was living in London in that time. And so that's the heroine. And there's a duke, but like, you know, he's like, comes from an abolitionist family. He's like an accidental duke. Because that's the other piece too. Like, viably, I can't write, it's not a Bible happy ending to me to have a man who has that level of position, who has not thought about systemic oppression or how the gentry has made their fortune through the bondage of Black bodies. Like, I can't actually write a hero.
Yeah.
It's not viable. It's not a viable happy ending for a man that's like chosen to ignore that to be heroic to a Black woman.
Right.
So I have to, and I think that's what we can do if we're writing own voices, or not own voices because we don't live there, but like people from our own identity in those times, because we're really thinking about that history in a way that I think could be a nice thing to do in historical, like what Beverly Jenkins has been doing for decades, like just presenting a different type of love story. That's not what we see in historical. So we'll see how it goes.
I'm sure it'll be fantastic. All right, I'm going to make it snappy because we've got like 20 seconds. So,
Yes.
2 books that we would recommend to non-romance readers to show the breadth of the genre. I said The Worst Best Man by Mia Sosa, which is a contemporary romance. It is hilarious and extremely modern and snappy. And then I said The Black Hawk or The Rogue Spy by Joanna Bourne, which is like spies, you know, Napoleonic France and England. It's sweeping epics. And it's completely different, and they're both romances, and they're both amazing.
Yeah, so one of mine was The Worst Best Man. So
Mia Sosa twice.
That's a confirmed one. And the other one was A Seditious Affair by K.J. Charles, which is probably, I mean, I think she's one of the finest romance authors in general, historical romance. She is exquisite, brilliant, and it's about 2 men who are at odds. It explores classism in England, in Regency England. It's just brilliant and super hot.
Yep. All right. I knew we could manage to talk for an hour. Now, if there are questions, I can stay around for a few more minutes, but I don't know if that's possible for either you or for Christian in the bookstore. But if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them. Or you could come find me on Twitter. It's at Olivia Writes, WRITES, all one word, Olivia Writes.
Yeah, and for me, you can just find me at Adriana Herrera Romance .com, and you can find where I am on social media there. But
Okay.
I'm mostly on Twitter.
Yeah, and oliviadade.com for my website, and there's a place to do it too. But they can go over 10 minutes. Do you have a couple minutes, Adriana? Because I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, if there's any questions, yeah.
Are there, let's see. I see Danny's Bookshelf says, are there any other subgenres either of you be interested in trying? I've actually written 2 futuristic romances, including one futuristic gothic. And that one I was hoping to at some point this next year revise because there's some stuff I need to change and maybe see what I can do about that. It's sort of like Jane Eyre in space.
Jane Eyre in space.
He's not. There are no wives and terrible.
Okay, good.
Terrible. There's no doing terrible mental health care. Shoved in the queen of the house.
Paranormal for me, like I have
too.
Yeah, like I'm really interested in writing more like witches and vampires. Like, who doesn't want Dominican vampires? I want Dominican vampires.
I actually have a ghost story idea. Like, I really want to write one where, like, they want to stay together. It's 2 ghosts. So they don't want the murder to be solved. So they try to, like, tamper with the people who are trying to solve the murder so that they'll be at peace.
Yeah.
They do not want the murder to be solved because they don't want to leave each other. So, anyway, I have some ideas for paranormal, too, yes.
Yeah, I would definitely write. I like mysteries, but I feel like I'm a better mystery reader than a mystery writer. So yes, hashtag Dominican vampires. I really want Dominican vampires. I've been toying with the idea of writing like a vampire, like erotic novella and see how it goes, and then go from there. But
I also want to write a time loop romance.
I've seen a couple of announcements for Time Loop, and I find that premise fascinating. Mm-hmm. So that would be something super cool. I bet you could do that really well and funny.
Well, let's see.
Write a Time Loop.
Were there any other questions? Oh, okay. Let's see. Are they going to be available soon? Okay. So I got my rights back to all of my Love Struck Librarians books other than the last one, which should be disappearing by Monday. And if it isn't, then there will be an email to various people. So here's the deal. There are things that I did in those books that I would not necessarily do again that are potentially harmful. So the question then becomes, do I go through and try to revise all those before putting them back out myself? Or do I spend that time writing new stuff? And I have not made that decision for sure yet, but I do know I have other things that I need to do first, and I want to make sure anything I put out in the world is not harmful.
That makes sense.
So it'll probably be a little while. I know a lot of libraries may still have it, so if you really want them, interlibrary loan might be a good option. Love libraries. They have so many great uses, but I don't know when they're going to be available again, and it's maybe a question of if in some cases rather than when.
Yeah. I love that series, so.
Well, thank you. Were there, let's see, if you can hang out with me. Okay, Adriana,
You can hang out with any of your characters for a day. Which character and what would you do? I feel like I would get along really well with Camilo, who's one of the heroes from my second book. It's the American Fairy Tale, which is the second book in the Dreamer series, just because he's also a domestic violence social worker in New York City, and like is kind of salty and kind of over everything, and that's very much how I feel at most of the time. So I think he and I would have a really great time. Also, he's married to a billionaire, so they're probably really fancy.
Yep. The hero, I just finished a draft, and he's the hero's best friend, and spoiler alert, his name is Alex. And excuse my language, Christian, the best sort of description of him I have is delightful asshole. And he is, like, to me, deeply entertaining and funny and, like, dramatic, like, totally extra. And I find him very entertaining. I'm sure I would want to kill him after a few hours, but I find him pretty entertaining.
Yes. You know, Milo is also very extra, and I think that would definitely be, like, I don't know, like, extra people can be really delightful to hang out with for a day.
Yeah. Why would you want to be scant?
Right. Any other questions?
Yep.
We're like, I mean,
4 minutes.
Yeah, we're 6 minutes over, so.
Anything else? All right.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for watching us. Anyone out there, thank you to Astoria Bookshop, because it was so lovely of you to ask us. And thank you to Adriana for thinking of me and for chatting with me. You're wonderful.
Oh, thank you, friend. Thank you, everyone. And as always, thank you for the indie bookshops that are supporting romance and Romance Bookstore Day. We are grateful that you are having us on and promoting romance.
And everyone out there, stay safe, stay healthy.
Wear your masks.
Wear your masks, and we wish you only the best. Hugs and kisses.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, Olivia. I love you.